Well, some of you will be getting ready for the NEBOSH General Certificate Practical Project called the NG2 or the IG2 if you're outside of the UK. And I've said this a few times before, this practical project is harder than the exam. All you have to do is fail to meet just one of the criteria, and you've failed, and you'll have to change your practical project, resubmit it, and hopefully pass on the second attempt. I'm going to run you through a list of stupid reasons, silly reasons why people sometimes fail this practical project. And when I say silly or stupid, I don't mean the student, the learner who submitted it. I mean, it's just small mistakes which are very easy to avoid, very easy to correct. Sometimes just one word, which literally means the difference between passing and failing. And if you make one of these mistakes and fail, you will be so frustrated. So let me run you through these. First mistake to avoid is failing to fill in all of the boxes. Yes, some students do fail to put in a timescale sometimes, or an action owner. They fail to put something in a box, and as a result, one of the criteria is not met. Number two, they don't pay attention to the bullet pointed information on the left hand side of the practical project template. These bullet points tell you exactly what information you need to write in there. And if you don't pay attention to that, there's a chance that you will miss a key piece of information and again, fail your project. Number three, in the methodology, people failed to explain how they identified the existing controls. Usually there's some kind of focus on the further controls, the additional controls, but people don't explain how they identified the existing controls. How do you identify existing controls? Well, usually by having a look to begin with. You walk around, you look, you examine, and you ask questions. You ask the people who do the tasks what they do to stay safe. You may also want to consider looking at SOPs and method statements and any other documentation you already have. Number four is kind of similar. You fail to explain how you identified the further controls. So people might, explain that they looked around, asked questions, check the SOPs, but then they don't explain where they got their recommendations from. And this requires a reference to guidance documents or approved codes of practice. And you would probably need to write something along the lines of, I identified the further controls by comparing what we currently do to what is required in these guidance documents, and choose the guidance documents carefully. Mistake number, I don't even know what number we are at, 5 now. It's in the risk assessment, and it's failing to identify 10 different hazards. Often people put 10 hazards, but 2 of the hazards are actually duplicates. For example, if you had some kind of job which required use of step ladders, and you had 2 different activities requiring use of the step ladder, if you put those down as 2 different hazards, you're probably going to fail, because it doesn't matter what the job is. The step ladder is the hazard. Using the step ladder is the hazard. Even though you've put it in 2 different rows, it's still the same hazard. And the examiner will count it as 1 hazard instead of 2. And if you've only got 10 hazards and your examiner says actually 2 of those are a duplicate, in fact you've only got 9 hazards, and therefore you fail. Mistake number 6 is failure to have at least 5 hazard categories. So look at the elements from the syllabus very carefully. Understand that, for example, element 5, all of the different hazard categories in there, they're kind of all in the same category, noise, vibration, radiation, psychological ill health and all of that. That's all one hazard category. And so you have to choose a variety of hazards spread out across 5 elements at least. So, 1 from element 5, maybe 2 from element 6, 1 from element 7, 1 from element 8, and so on. Another mistake is being vague on the injuries. So for example, if you had someone working off a step ladder and you said they could fall and hurt themselves, that's probably going to result in a fail. It's important on the risk assessment that you are specific in the how might people be harmed. You have to write down the nature of the injury and not just write down something like, they could hurt themselves, they could injure themselves. That's not good enough. Where are we now? Is it mistake number 7? I've completely lost count. failure to write down control measures that are legally required. So your risk assessment has to be suitable and sufficient. That means, one of the things that means is that it has to identify risk controls that are required by law. At the bare minimum, the risk assessment has to bring you into compliance with the relevant legislation. So for example, some controls are just required by law. So if you had, say, if you had local exhaust ventilation, then under the cost regulations, you are required to get that thoroughly examined every 14 months. If you've got LEV and you don't write down, either in your existing controls or in your further controls, a 14-month thorough examination, that's a fail. Same thing for forklifts and cranes. You need LOLA inspections. But it's not just for those inspections. It's going to be things like training. If you've got like an electrical hazard, you need some training. That's a legal requirement. You need some PAT testing. That's that's not a legal requirement, but it's required. It's required in the guidance, and the guidance is, well, it's just an industry standard. You have to do the PAT testing. So I would recommend you go through your course materials with a fine-tooth comb, look at all of the different control measures which you can use to control the hazards, and use that kind of like a menu, and ask yourself which of these are required. Mistake number 8, I think, is failing to write down an owner and a timescale for every single action. So let's say you've got 5 actions, which is a lot, 5 actions against a particular hazard. It's like each one of those needs a timescale and an action owner. Getting on to the actions now, a big mistake to avoid is choosing actions that are not actions. Yeah, those 3 priority actions have to be specific. For example, don't put down things like improve the safety of the workshop. That's not an action. It's like, how do you do that? What are the actions I need to take to improve the safety of the workshop? Improve levels of stress. Okay, that's a little bit more specific, but it doesn't tell me what I need to do to improve the levels of stress. Do a manual handling risk assessment. Well, okay, that's an action, I suppose, but it's not an action which reduces risk. You're just assessing the risk. And so what changes to the manual handling activity, what mechanical handling equipment, but those are actions. Install LEV, issue safety gloves, deliver this particular type of training. Those are specific actions which we need. Next mistake, in the general legal, moral, financial arguments, people do the moral, people do the financial, but people usually fail to include both criminal and civil consequences of failing to control the risk. People usually put down the criminal stuff, the improvement notices, the prosecutions, the fines, but often they fail to mention civil claims, that is, a legal consequence. In the specific legal arguments, people are usually very good at putting down a law that is being broken, but often they fail to explain why that law is being broken. So, for example, if you had, say, if you were breaking the work at height regulations because there was a lack of a guardrail, you wouldn't just say we're in breach of the work at height regulations. You would have to say we are in breach of the work at height regulations because they require that we prevent falls. Failing to guard the edge of this pit, excavation, for example, the edge of the roof, failing to guard this could be considered a breach of that requirement. Next mistake is likelihood and severity. Too much focus on risk ratings. People might write down likelihood is 4 out of 5, severity is 3 out of 5, therefore the risk is a medium or high. Now, we're not interested in risk ratings. What we're interested in is an explanation of what makes an injury likely or unlikely. So you could talk about the duration of exposure. You could talk about the number of people involved. The more people involved, the more likely it is that one of them is going to get hurt. You would talk about the frequency of exposure and so on. And then as for the consequence or the severity, you would talk about just the injury, the nature of the injuries that could be sustained if they did have an incident. Moving on to whether the actions are effective or not, some people fail because they express doubts over whether the actions they're recommending will actually control the risk, and that's just an immediate fail. If you're in any doubt that it controls the risk, say go back and choose a different action, or just improve that action in some way. You have to be able to say this action is going to fully control the risk, or it's going to reduce the risk down so far as is reasonably practicable. It's okay to point out maybe certain gaps or failures. For example, so you could introduce some LEV, and it's okay to point out that, well, for the LEV to fully control the risk, we also have to maintain it, and check it and inspect it and use it and all of those things. And so there are some procedures that are associated with the LEV. By itself, the LEV won't fix it. We have to do all the administrative controls as well. That's okay, but don't say, well, we'll put the LEV in and then we'll just have to see if that works or not. That's a little bit too wishy-washy. Moving on now to getting to the end of the list, review dates. I have known people to fail because they didn't write down a specific review date. They would write down the date and the month, but not the year. They might say, oh, we'll review it on the 5th of October. Like, well, yeah, what year? What year? This year? Next year? In 10 years? I don't know. I've seen some pretty facetious examiner comments on that. Like, well, which 5th of October? So please write down the date in full with the year. And last, I will say this, is when you write down a review date, when you choose a review date that doesn't contradict something else you've said. So if you've said that the standard review period in your organization is every 12 months, then choose a review date that is in 12 months. Don't say, oh, we review risk assessments every 12 months, but given the risks are high, we'll review this one in 3 months on the 5th of July or something like that. I've known at least one person to fail because of the contradiction between those two things. So there we are. If you know of any other silly mistakes to avoid, please let me know in the comments. And if you've got any questions about NG2, IG2, please feel free to ask me in the comments. Don't ask me to read it. I'm not going to read it. And I'll probably block you if you ask me to as well, because that's against the rules. Anyway, have a lovely day.